Yeah. You're not on camera, so you're good. What made
I could be on.
No, no, yeah, that's right. You're meant to be a star.
You want to have some more chairs?
Yeah, we could probably set up any more chairs. We can move this set it here.
The webcam. Yeah, but I mean.
And
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you. Start on time, end on time. So I sent a text to Paul Olson, Alice's son. I said, how's she doing? She's doing great. We transferred her to the Masonic home yesterday, and she was in good spirits. Some leg pain, but not nearly as bad as after her back surgery. And I will send back a text that says, Matt, and says, hey, and that my efforts have changed. So with that, I'll turn this over to Sue.
I'd like to introduce our speaker, and his name is John Moon from the Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation at the University of Minnesota. And his talk today will be moving from ageism to age-friendly.
All right, thanks, Sue. Do I need to use the microphone or can you? All right.
Okay.
All right. Can you hear me through the mic?
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Okay.
There's a comment made about this group. Half of them have hearing aids, and the other half.
Yeah, but.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you for having me here today. As Sue said, my name is Rajan. I'm from the University of Minnesota, and I'm a gerontologist. I'm someone that studies aging. And specifically, I'm interested actually on the policy side of aging. So, anyone ever heard of Medicare? Social Security? So those are the programs that I have real interest in. So I'm very happy. Thank you for having me here today on your beautiful setting. Driving was a little harried. I forget about the rush hour traffic down here on 494, and always seems to be construction. I guess they'll continuously forever be building the highway down here. But got here. Yes, they need to. Yes. Unfortunately, there isn't much stuff with what we have. So. Before I begin, I'd like to start a little bit with land acknowledgement. This is something that we do at the University of Minnesota, really to understand our past, understand where we came from and how we can really make productive change for the future. And so the university ourselves, as well as this campus here, is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. And specifically, our university resides on Dakota land that was ceded in treaties of 1837 and 1851. And I really like this little image from the federal government that says no matter the platform, it's still native land. So those who may be watching on streaming or watching later, digital space is still native space. So again, we do land acknowledgements. They're a small step, but we think an important step, again, to acknowledge our past and really understand how we can move forward productively in our future. All right. So during the presentation, feel free to ask questions. I apologize that I have to leave promptly at the end because I have another presentation that I have to get back to. So that one isn't quite as exciting. It's for university students on how to build better presentations. So hopefully I'll have a good presentation today, or I'll go back and say, wow, they hated me. I shouldn't be doing this topic. So I've always really been interested in gerontology, which, as I said, is the study of aging. So I've taken courses on everything from, biological aspects of aging to, like I said, the policy. And over the last couple of decades, I've really become aware through my research and my work in policy of the insidiousness of ageism. How many people have heard of the term ageism before? Yes? Anyone experienced ageism before in their myself as well.
Last couple of years.
That's a great example. So I also find it really creeps up very unexpectedly in conversations. And over the years, I've gotten this fascination with language. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how using language and reframing the way we think and talk about aging will really shift our attitudes towards older adults and aging and move really from more of an ageist society to an age-friendly society. So last year I met with a number of my classmates for my undergrad. I'm going on 25 years since my undergrad, and we were all updating each other really about our families and work and how we were able to kind of work through the pandemic. And when I discussed my work, I was asked this question: why did you choose aging? And at first, it really seemed like a simple question. It's actually a question I've been asked dozens of times. People ask me, why did you choose to go into aging? Why do you want to work with older adults? And at the time, I didn't really give much thought about it. But, as I, in the pandemic, sat at home watching countless YouTube videos and streaming and TV, I've been thinking more about sort of ageism and the words. And it's kind of interesting that a lot of people think that I'm kind of an anomaly, like that I had to justify the fact that I wanted to work with older adults. Like, I chose this as a career. I didn't fall into it. It wasn't a backup plan. Ever since my first volunteering as a companion for an older gentleman living with Alzheimer's disease, I've just always had a passion. And it really further opened my eyes to other interesting language and phrases that are being used. For example, I recently watched a clip on YouTube. It was a comedian, and she said that she had reached the age where she no longer trips, but she falls. And I found that really interesting. Like, at what point in our life do all of a sudden we stop tripping and catching ourselves? And now we're falling. There's something wrong with us, and we caused this fall. So I'm sure you've seen other examples of this that seem to be harmless, but are actually harmful. The one that I often think about is when people introduce themselves and they say they're so many years young, right? They don't want to use the O word, old, right? So let's, by the count of 3, why don't we all say old together, just so we can get that word out there. So ready? 1, 2, 3. Old. Oh, perfect. We're all still here. This is great. So, anyone, bought just a greeting card recently, and in that greeting card aisle, you see the black section with all the tombstones, and you buy a card for someone who, God forbid, turned 50 and is over the hill, and you've never done that before, right? So always, could you imagine if you go to the greeting card aisle and you're buying someone a sympathy card because all of a sudden they're becoming a mother? Or, some other event in their life, that's monumental, right? So, just some things that I continue to think about. So, as I mentioned, always been interested in aging, and I developed this statement while I served as the executive director of the Minnesota Leadership Council on Aging, which is ageism is a pervasive form of bigotry that must be eliminated. It's sort of the last still acceptable ism. It's still okay for us to be ageist. And we need to change that thought. We need to reframe the way we think about aging. And so this is something that I continue to think about, and it really shapes my work every day at the university. So in today's workshop, which I need to make sure all the clocks are behind me, so excuse me, I promise I'm not texting, I'm just looking at the time here. So in today's little workshop, the time we have together, we're going to delve into the history and origins of ageism, how aging and older adults have been perceived over time in advocacy and in media. We're going to talk about some of the different frameworks that we can use to reimagine aging, to think differently about aging. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about what research says about how we can promote change and some of the community efforts, an effort that you can adopt at your congregation. So any questions so far before I move on to a little bit more complicated stuff? Good. If there were questions, we might have a little trouble. It's going to get a little bit harder, but I promise I'll keep doing it. So today's session is going to focus on both changes that can occur at the organizational level, so things that you can do here at your congregation, but also those changes that you can make on an individual level. They're not mutually exclusive. They actually overlap. The changes are very complementary. All right. So let's start by talking a little bit about ageism. And I would like to start by posing a question to you, and I'd like you to take some time at your table to explore the question. And the question I'd like you to explore is, how do you define old age? Anybody else? So why don't you take a few minutes at your table and just talk about how do you define old age?
Trying to stay off camera here. Gonna be shy, but I'm gonna stay off camera. Okay, this is be careful. This is a question I'm going to be real careful. Yeah. So you're here. Maybe
when your body is
and they'll say, what was, how was the first thing,
I know it's really common for. Yeah, but it's.
There's also the idea of growing old, or are you old? I would like to look at it as she growing old. It's a process rather than
because mine is considered.
and our life.
Why don't we call back? What were some of the things you talked about in your some words or phrases that came up? Old is when you can't do what you wanted to do. Okay, we have mindset over here. Other thoughts?
Pretty much all the same thing loud.
When we know more history than people
people around us.
There you go.
When our youth is their history.
Yeah, right.
That's a good one. We're going to challenge some of the ageist comments, perhaps, and really think through how, aging is very individualized, right? I liked the comment about, it's older than me, right? Well, old age is older than me. There's actually an interesting study that was done in a nursing home where they asked residents, are you old? And one of the residents said, oh gosh, no. That's not me, that's that old guy down the hall. But the person they'd asked was 95. And the person that he was pointing to was 101. So,
Always looking for something again.
yeah, exactly, yeah. So, thank you for that. Keep that in mind as we go through and talk a little bit about ageism and how it kind of manifests itself. Well, when I talk to groups that typically, are not, senior care providers or people who work in aging services, I like to do a little background on why is talking about aging, older adults, and ageism important. And it's because we are in the midst of a demographic shift that we have never seen before. And I was talking with Sue earlier that demographic shift obviously is playing out right here in your own backyard as our society changes. This is a chart actually from the Minnesota State Demographic Center that shows the number of 65 plus people that were added to Minnesota's population over various decades. So starting in the 70s, for example, there were 70,600 people 65 plus added to our population. So I'm just going to add some bars here to the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, the 2020s, and the 2030s. And you'll notice in 2030, it's still significantly larger than any of the 4 decades from the 70s to 2000s. This is the very, what I think, exciting demographic shift. So this chart you're going to see is slowly changing. I promise you're not having a stroke. It's all going well. The screen is changing. What's happening is every time the screen changes, we're moving forward in time 5 years. So we're in 1965 right now. So the blue bar represents the percentage of different age groups in our society. Across the bottom, you can see it starts at under 5, and right now goes up to the centenarians, and it's going to reset in a little bit. But I want you to see how the picture is changing, how perhaps you're seeing a change from what we have here, a pyramid shape, to more of a rectangle. What this means is in the early 1900s, we had lots of younger people and not very many older people. And here we have what's known as the baby boom generation, right? And that has been a significant shift. We now are becoming an older, far older society, and we will be actually for the next 4 to 5 decades, unless there are radical changes to the number of children that people have, right, as people age. So I have one more chart.
Is that impact involved by the fact that people live longer?
It is, yep, it is. There are actually generally 3 reasons why we're becoming a more older society. The first is that people are living longer, right? At the turn of the century in 1900, our average life expectancy was about 45, and now we're pushing into the mid-80s. The second one is a decrease in our birth rate. So people are just having a lot fewer children. And then the last one is that aging of the baby boom generation.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Did that shift at all because of the pandemic in the last few years? Because it seemed that we have more older people. Right?
Yeah, it hasn't shifted significantly. So the question was, did we see any shifts related to the pandemic? There were some, but not real significant shifts. So one more chart, again, from the Minnesota State Demographic Center. There's going to be 3 lines on here. The horizontal line here is looking at over time. The first line that we have here, which is really hard to see, color, it's sort of a blue. These are people age 18 to 24. So people who have maybe left high school, going into the workforce, going into college. It has remained relatively stable across time. The second would be the 65 plus. So this is the gold line. And you'll see, starting at 20, we get some significant increases. And the last line we have, the green line, are 5 to 17-year-olds. So these are our children in elementary, middle, and high school put together. And I would like to just point out here in 2020, there is an intersection between the gold and the green lines. So in 2020, we actually flipped from a society where we have more older people than children in elementary, middle, and high school put together. And that will continue with us for the next 4 to 5 decades, right? In fact, last year, we counted 1 million people, 60 plus, in the state of Minnesota. The first time ever in our history, the largest population of any age group right now, our 60 plus population. So this is all very, to me, exciting. It provides lots of opportunities. We'll talk about some of those opportunities, but we also need to acknowledge that it also has a number of challenges that we need to think through, right? And I'm sure a lot of those challenges you are thinking about here in your congregation as well. So I wanted to go back to defining old age. We kind of brainstormed some ways that we define old age here together. There are some other sort of accepted ways that we can define old age. The first one often is chronological. Let's just pick a number. Anyone over that number is old, and anyone under that number is young, right?
That's not what age you wanted to start with.
Exactly. The issue is we don't have a big consensus on what that number is, right? And it really does differ depending on what your actual age is, right? The next one that we can use is biologic. So biologic would be the idea that we have medical sophistication to be able to measure some of the things that are occurring to our bodies. So some of you maybe have had a bone density test. That's an example of a way that we can biologically date you. We can give you an age based on your bones. And that's just one example. We can go down to the very DNA and look at your cells and the structures in your cells and look at how well they're dividing and give you that biologic age. Another one would be benefits, not just government benefits, but other benefits. One benefit that you may remember if you had the pleasure of turning 50 is an invitation. Did anyone get that invitation? Yes. Welcome to AARP. Right? We often repress the second invitation we get. Does anyone remember the second invitation? The invitation to get your colonoscopy. Welcome to AARP, and we're going to look at your insides. Those are the 2 insights you get.
Actually, that age is moving lower.
It is moving lower. It is moving lower. So definitely aging has changed. So the government also sets forth sort of a definition of public benefits based on age. So one of them, for example, the Older Americans Act, the federal government sets the age at 60 plus. That's what they define as an older American. Medicare, when you become eligible for Medicare based on your age, it's at 65. And Social Security sort of has a graduated rate depending on when you were born. It could have been 60, 62, 65, 67, 69, whenever you were born. So that's definitely a way to look at sort of old age. Another way would be to look at it through popular media, right? What we see on TV, what we see in the news. And I have a couple examples of that. There was a movie, probably, I like to think 10 years ago, but it was made in 1990, which at this point now is a little bit more than 10 years ago. But that's what happens, right? Our perception of time changes as we age a little bit, right? So the movie was called First Wives Club. Anyone ever heard of the First Wives Club? So it's a really good movie with Bette Midler, Goldie Hawn, and Diane Keaton. They're 3 women who, sort of are in their middle age, and they're all 3 of them, their husbands left them for a younger woman, right? And Goldie Hawn actually has a really interesting part in the movie where she plays an actress in the movie, right? And she's going to a plastic surgeon because she is, like all of us, aging, right? Everyone is aging, according to concept to keep in mind. And she tells the plastic surgeon that, she needs to get some stuff done because she's an actress. And the plastic surgeon is saying, no, you're beautiful. You're a classic actress. Why would you do anything? And she says very comedically that, there are really 3 roles for women in Hollywood. You can be the babe, the district attorney, or driving Miss Daisy. And she wants to be young, science fiction young is the phrase that she uses. And the comedic value, it's very funny, but there also is this element of realism, right? Like how women experience aging is very different from how men experience ages, right? And how you put ages in articles, in news articles, when it really doesn't matter, or those types of things. Another popular media that I'm sure most of you have heard about, the Golden Girls. Anyone heard of the Golden Girls? So the Golden Girls, a television program in the 80s, late 80s, and obviously those of us in Minnesota hold near and dear to our heart because of, Rose, played by Betty White from Minnesota. Did you know that the Golden Girls were in their 50s? So Rose was 55, Dorothy was established as being in her early 50s, and Blanche was 53. And they figured that out because, they talked about their birth date in the, in the show at some point. So imagine if the Golden Girls was repeated today. What would the women look like and what ages would they be? So again, just a different way we think about sort of aging. And then lastly, the self-perception. So we've talked about this a little bit, right? How we perceive our own age to be. So let's take a look a little bit at the evolution of older adults over time through history. And let's start kind of back in the pre-1900s. Well, generally aging actually was revered because it was fairly rare. When you're looking at a life expectancy in your mid-40s, if someone lived to be 70 or 80 or 90, it was pretty rare. And so often these people were revered. They were considered elders in the community, right? They were able to pass down stories. They were able to pass down culture. They were sort of the conduit between generations. Moving into the early 1900s, we come up to the Great Depression. And in the Great Depression, obviously we have, widespread famine and poverty occurring, almost universally across the globe. And what we start to see is a framing of older adults as a problem, the problem of the aged, because they are taking jobs that younger people should have. Keep in mind, Medicare wasn't enacted until 1965. So if anyone had a need and they needed to go to the doctor, there was no way for them to pay for it other than out of pocket. So they became a financial strain if you had any, chronic conditions or physical issues that you needed to go to the doctor for. So you start seeing in research and in media this sort of concept of, anyone ever see Snow White, one of the first Disney movies? How is aging portrayed in that? It's the wicked old witch, right? The wicked stepmother, right? That's sort of the paradigm of aging. Moving into the 1960s, we begin to have a lot of the social movement organizations occurring, civil rights movement, women's movement. In the 60s, we start to define, really diversify our definition of old age. So on one hand, Medicare is passed in 1965, recognizing that older people may experience chronic conditions and need some financial support in order to help with those. But at the same time, 1965 also passed the Older Americans Act. And the Older Americans Act goals are these broad set of objectives saying that older people have the right to age in community, to be valuable assets. They have the right to a secure retirement income. So again, this diversity of old age from needing health care to being independent assets in their community. And then today we sort of have this mixed bag of definition of aging all across the spectrum. And sometimes it's sort of depicted as two different groups. One is a group of people that are frail, diseased, senile, in their need of constant and expensive care. And on the other end of the spectrum, we've got active, wholly independent, and really requiring no support, right? And I'm going to talk about how these extremes are both extremely ageist in their perceptions of older adults. Because in reality, we are both of these things at all times, right? AARP actually has a really nice framework that I'm going to talk about how these intersect very well. So we get to the idea of me and them, and the idea that I'm not old because old is a bad thing. It's someone older than me, right? I'm not old. And the whole idea that we want to think about when we're reframing aging is that we're all aging, and actually aging is a good thing. Because if you're not aging, you're dead. Exactly. So the idea that aging is this process, and very often we talk about things like the aging population, and in reality, we're all part of the aging population, and I'll talk again about reframing some of that. So I mentioned AARP, and I will say that I don't work for AARP. I'm not an advocate for them. I work with them very often, but what I do like is they have this concept of disrupt aging. And AARP has talked about that out in our communities, we have people that are known as super seniors. These are people who are engaged, they are part of their communities, they are with family, they are engaging lifelong learning. We also have vulnerable seniors. These are seniors who may be experiencing chronic conditions, maybe cognitive impairment like Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia that may need to rely on others for some support. And the thing that I like about KRP is, again, they say that these are the same people. That even if a person is living with dementia, they have such valuable assets to families and communities, even though that it can be a disease that's very difficult to live with and go through. It's important not to dismiss people that are experiencing that cognitive impairment, forgetfulness, memory issues. So I really like this concept of, we're all of these things at the same time. So, any questions so far? All right, good. So far, straightforward. So I've talked about aging, and this presentation is about ageism. I haven't talked a lot about ageism. So let's shift a little bit. What is ageism? So ageism was a term that was first coined in 1969 by a geriatrician, a physician who specializes in the healthcare of older adults. His name was Dr. Robert Butler, a very famous geriatrician. And he published it in a journal called The Gerontologist, which is sort of one of the foremost journals on research related to aging. And how Dr. Butler coined this term was, as a physician in a hospital, he recognized that a number of his fellow physicians were dismissive or even at times condescending to their older patients when they came in with issues. So for example, they would come in with pain and the physician would say, well, of course you have pain, you're old. Or they would come in and say that they're having memory issues and the doctor would say, well, of course you're having memory issues, you're old, right? The interesting thing is we have memory issues all across the lifespan, but for some reason, only when we're old do we think that it's due to our aging, right? And I use my own self as an example. I'm terrible with names. I can't remember names, and that's really bad for a faculty member when you're working with students and you can't remember any of their names. So I just come right out and say, I can't remember names. I will be so supportive of you as a student. I will, go the distance for you. I will remember your face. I'll remember the class you're in. But God forbid, I'm not going to remember your name. It's just not possible. When I turn 80 or 85 or 90, I hope that I don't think, oh my gosh, I can't remember anyone's name. I think I have Alzheimer's disease. Right? No, it's just a lifelong thing, right? So our memory does change over time, but not pathologically. So he published this in the Gerontologist. He said that he didn't invent it. He was just the first to happen to write it down. And so since then, we've been using his definition, and it has evolved over time. In 1975, the definition became a process of systematic stereotyping and discrimination of people because they are old. In 1990s, there was an element added to positive ageism. Anyone ever had a senior discount before? That's an example of positive ageism. And also that ageism impacts younger adults. It doesn't just impact older adults. That younger adults can be seen as inexperienced, impetuous, disengaged from community, those types of things. We were talking about technology, right? The reality is younger people know how to use technology so well because they actually grew up with it. It isn't the fact that they're young, it's the fact that they're growing up at this point of time. Give any 10-year-old a rotary phone and ask them to use it, they will have no idea.
Yeah.
But that's technology that you grew up with, right? And so it isn't so much about our age, it's about when we're growing up in time, right? So keep that in mind when we think about young
Try to
people.
find a place to plug in.
Yeah, find a place to plug in the road. It's very difficult. So there are lots of different types of ages. I'm going to go through a couple of them. I'm not going to read all of these, but one example would be institutional ageism. That's ageism which occurs when an institution perpetuates ageism through its actions. So for whatever reason, they have policies that are making it more difficult for older people or younger people to be actively engaged, right? And we need to think about those and challenge those policies, and I'll talk about ways we can do that. Interpersonal ageism would be ageism that occurs within social interactions with our friends, our acquaintances, and colleagues. Internalized ageism is when a person internalizes ageist beliefs and applies them to themselves. The senior moment, classic example. I'm old, so I'm going to forget things. So just some types of ageism. And then here are some kind of examples of ageism. So making offensive generalizations about a specific generation, disregarding someone's concerns or wishes, taking advantage of them, using someone's age as a justification to undermine or deceive them or control them happens a lot when we're looking at fraud and abuse, particularly financial fraud, which is on the upswing right now of people across all ages. Hiring or asking about age is a clear sign of ageism, or using things like an entry level or emerging leader. These are all keywords that they don't want to hire an old person. They want to hire a young person, right? Viewing older people as out of touch, less productive, stuck in their ways, treating people as though they're invisible, unintelligent, or expendable, making ageist jokes that imply someone's less valuable. All these are examples of ageism. So there's a national study called the National Poll on Healthy Aging, and this is data from 2020. They asked some questions about ageism and had a person ever experienced ageism. 82% of the respondents had experienced ageism regularly. 65% of them identified it in media. 45% in interpersonal ageism, so with colleagues, with friends, with family, and 36% could identify that they experienced internalized ageism, that they think they are less worthy because they are old. So why is it important for us to combat ageism? Why can't we just have these jokes and laugh them off and those types of things? Well, there's lots of research to show that the negative implications of ageism are pretty significant. This is just one study from a couple of decades ago, actually, that people were exposed to negative views of aging, and then they were followed over time, and it was found that they perform worse on cognitive tasks, they have poorer health, and they live shorter lives because they felt that their life was actually devalued, right? It's really important for us to also talk about identity, and that we are not just an age, but we have other ways that we identify ourselves, whether it's our gender, where we live, the language we speak. And this is an interesting term. You might have heard intersectionality. Intersectionality is basically the coming together of our various identities. And that intersectionality either gives us access or privilege to things, or it may create barriers, right? And so the term intersectionality was actually coined by a legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. And she really was interested in this concept, being someone who was part of both the civil rights movement and the feminist movement. And she believed that the civil rights movement really failed to address and devalued her feminine identity. And the feminist movement failed to address and devalued her Black identity. And so she looked at how when she was in groups, how she was treated differently because of the intersectionality of her identities. So it's important for us to understand that we not only are aging, but we also are experiencing both the benefits and challenges of other parts of our identity. So ageism can intersect with things like racism, classism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, and things like location. Being in a rural community versus an urban community gives you access to different things. Anyone have any questions about that? Or I'm going to move into sort of some of the final parts about, okay, now we know about ageism, what can we do to kind of shift our way of thinking and shift our communities? All right. So there are a number of different ways that we can really start to reset our thinking and change the way we really plan for our communities. And communities, I mean not only cities, towns, and counties, but also like a faith community like this one. One of them is by really thinking carefully about the words that we use and how those words influence our attitudes towards something, right? Language is very powerful. It's the way we use to communicate. And words are very evocative. Not only give us a definition, but they also give us images, feelings, emotions, and thoughts, right? Beyond just the word themselves, right? And so this nonprofit called the Frameworks Institute has this initiative called Reframing Aging. And they've done a lot of research on words that are used to describe older people and how older people are depicted in the media and in advocacy efforts. I'm going to talk a little bit about what their research shows about actual words that are used to describe older adults. I already talked about disrupting aging with AARP. AARP does have an amazing program called Disrupt Aging in the Classroom, and they use a whole army of volunteers that go into college classrooms and do a talk on ageism and aging. It's a free program. Any faculty member across the US can ask for it. And the volunteers go through a rigorous training program where they're given a curriculum. They have to do some practice, presentations. They do it on a team together. So if anyone's interested in that, I would highly recommend looking that up. It's a great opportunity. Disrupt Aging, I have just a quote that I'd like to share about their program. Disrupt Aging is a place to have a new conversation, often funny, sometimes raw, always honest about how we want to live and age. We will celebrate all those who own their age. We will hold a mirror up to the ageist beliefs around us. We will feature new ways of living and aging and the products and solutions that make this possible. That just really speaks to me, this concept, especially sort of being a Scandinavian, Minnesotan, often funny, sometimes raw, always honest. Like that's our basic conversations, right? That we have in Minnesota. We pepper in a little passive aggressiveness too every day. How we do that. But I really just kind of like that concept because it is. We have to have honest conversations. We do need to laugh. Humor is very important. It's very therapeutic. But sometimes it can be raw too because there are challenges related to aging. Your risks for chronic conditions do substantially increase, right? Over half of the people over the age of 85 do experience cognitive impairment. And so these are challenges we need to think about, right? So there are two other concepts I want to talk about. One is reimagine aging. This is a framework that's used by a number of states. The state of Massachusetts uses it, but it's also used in other areas. For example, locally, Senior Community Services, anyone ever heard of that nonprofit? It's based in Hennepin County here. They provide chore services and homemaker services. They operate senior centers as well in Hennepin and Wright County. They host an annual Reimagine Aging conference that really explores emerging technologies that are key to combating the loneliness epidemic. And I know you have a visiting program here for older adults who can't get to your actual physical congregation. And that recently, you might have heard in the news, there's been a lot of research on social isolation, and that social isolation is the latest public health crisis, that it impacts our mental health and our physical health greatly. So really important to think about that. The last thing I want to talk about is age-friendly before going into a few tips. So age-friendly is it's a concept that's been around for a number of years, probably about 3 or 4 decades, but it's really coming together just most recently over the last 5 years around this concept of an age-friendly ecosystem. And I'll say that an age-friendly ecosystem is sort of an exercise in academia. So academics like to use big words like ecosystems and that kind of thing. But the whole idea is that our communities, regardless of whether it's your city government, whether it's the clinic that you go to or your faith congregation, should be accessible and should actively engage older adults. And so there are a number of different frameworks that I'm going to talk about that can be adopted to help sort of set the stage for success as it relates to being age-friendly. And the first one I want to talk about is age-friendly communities. And age-friendly communities is an initiative that was developed by the World Health Organization, and in the United States, it's actually managed by AARP. You would think I work for AARP, but I don't. They just do a lot in aging, so obviously I'm going to talk about them. Basically, this is a process by which a town, city, county, or state can do a very purposeful initiative to explore their community and really start to make change to engage older adults actively. It's a process that looks at what are known as the 8 domains of livability. So for example, the city of Minneapolis is an age-friendly community. What I will say is being an age-friendly community doesn't mean that you're getting an award or a trophy to say, great job, you're doing a great job, you don't have to do anything else. Enrolling in the Age-Friendly Community Network is actually a commitment to look forward 5 years and develop a plan to ensure that you're working towards age friendliness. So we can all sort of argue, is Minneapolis age friendly or not? That's an argument we can have. But the idea is they want to commit to try and becoming one, right? They want to invest resources and time to doing that. So you can see that 8 domains of livability include things like housing and social participation and transportation. Basically what happens over a 5-year process is you join the network, the mayor or the county board or the governor has to write a letter and say we're interested in enrolling in the network. During the first year, you conduct a community needs assessment. You understand what's happening in your community and where there are needs. You then develop an action plan in the second year. And in years 3 through 5, you implement that action plan. You start to, let's say you're having major barriers and challenges related to transportation. So you want to create a loop bus service, that just kind of goes around your community. So you develop that plan on how you do it, how are you going to get it funded, who's going to use it, where is it going to stop. And then in year 5, you evaluate the impact of that work, and then you change. You do another assessment. It's time to go to your next 5-year cycle. So it's sort of a plan for communities. We have 17 communities in Minnesota that are enrolled in the network, and the state of Minnesota is also enrolled. So we have our 5-year plan that we're working on. I sit on the Age-Friendly Minnesota Council, so we talk about this all the time. We have an executive director. This is her passion, her work, to ensure that Minnesota, the state agencies, work together to ensure that older adults are active and engaged in our communities. The second one I want to talk about is our healthcare system. So inevitably, at any given time during our life, we are going to interact with a healthcare system. I did it last week, had a little medical emergency, went to the urgency room. Anyone ever heard of an urgency room? Evidently now there's not just urgent care and an emergency room, but there's something between them. Our healthcare system, we could have a whole other conversation about how maybe we need to work on making that a little bit better. But there is a framework called Age-Friendly Health Systems, which was an initiative of the John Hartford Foundation and the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And it's in partnership with the Hospital Association. And basically, this is attempting to transform our healthcare systems so that we provide the best care possible to older adults and their families, the most geriatric competent care. And what we focus on is not the diagnoses that a person walks in the room on, but we focus on the first content here, which is what matters. What matters to that person? They may be coming in with 12 diagnoses on 14 medications, but they don't care about any of that. They just want to make sure that they can still see their grandchild once a week or provide that service. So then you shift your care from let's look at all your diagnoses, give you some new diagnoses, to how do we ultimately achieve that goal that you want? How do we get the services and supports in order for you to be able to do that? So it's about transforming our healthcare system. There are a couple of health systems and clinics that are implementing the age-friendly health system. There's only a couple in Minnesota, so we do have to work on this, particularly because we have an extreme shortage of specialists, right? So from social work perspective, 87% of social workers are going to work with an older adult. Less than 1% ever take a class on aging. About 90% of nurses will work with an older adult. Less than 1% take a class in aging. Physicians, less than 1% specialize in geriatrics. Physical therapy, same number, about 80% will work with an older adult. Less than 1% have ever had a class on aging. And so we're trying to transform those systems. The last one I'm going to talk about is one that we take very near and dear to our heart, which is age-friendly universities, which is how do we engage older adults and lifelong learners, because we believe that that enriches our campus. We believe that intergenerational interactions among students just simply enrich what we do at the university. So we were the first university in Minnesota to enroll in the global network of age-friendly universities. We have an age-friendly university council. I would love to invite you on June 26th to come to Age-Friendly University Day. We do it in the summer, so parking is very good. Getting to campus is not a problem. It's at the McNamara Alumni Center. We have a day filled of just lifelong learning opportunities. And so we will have a keynote. This year it's being done by Diana Pierce. Anyone know Diana Pierce, former news anchor? She has an initiative now about finding purpose later in life, right? She's now retired and an older woman and is interested in staying engaged and finding purpose. We'll then have a panel who are reflecting on that. The panel will be moderated by NPR correspondent Chris Farrell. If any of you have heard Chris Farrell, he does a lot on economics and aging. And then we have some breakout sessions, one kind of on financial abuse and fraud. We have a session on climate change and aging. Why is it important for older adults to think about climate change and our environment for the future? So definitely come. There's a small charge, but we have a no-ask scholarship process. So if you're not able to pay, you just select the $0 amount. So it includes breakfast and lunch. We'll have a good time. Goldie will be there. That's our first age-friendly university day was last year, and even though we had retired Supreme Court Justice and former Viking Alan Page there as our keynote. We had these amazing breakout sessions. The highlight was Goldie. People just wanted to see the darn gopher. So anyway. So I'm going to end now with just a couple of kind of thoughts and reflections on things that you can do to reframe aging, right? So what do we know about what influences aging? Let me find my right slide here. So when we look at research, there really are two major things that influence ageism. One is the knowledge of aging. So this is why we at the university find it critically important that our students graduate with an understanding of the demographic shift that's occurring in our communities. That they get a little knowledge about aging, which will change their attitudes towards older adults. The second one is positive contact. So this actually was the title of a book written by Gordon Allport in the 1950s, and it really redefined the relationship between intergroup conflict and prejudice. And really the thought prior to his book was the concept of separate but equal, right? Everyone here is separate but equal. The idea that we have to keep people who are different apart from one another because it increases conflict. That was the prevailing thought. His book, Positive Contact, actually said that more contact actually decreases prejudice. We increase our knowledge, we decrease our fears. And so the same thing happens in aging. Positive contact actually directly impacts your attitudes towards older adults and aging. So we try and get college students, high school students, elementary students engaged with grandparents, engaged in senior centers, in communities, even engaged in nursing homes to understand the aging process. So some of the things that we recommend is encouraging and adopting age-friendly initiatives in communities. There are age-friendly faith community initiatives. They're important to think about. You have to think about the physical structure of your congregation. I was so pleasantly surprised to be able to just walk in the door without having to walk up a million steps, which people love to build churches up on steps. I don't know, they just want you to be higher, I guess, than the ground, like the closer to God, maybe, is that the philosophy? But it creates such barriers for people to be able to get into your facility, because when these churches were built, there was no such thing as an elevator, right? So thinking about and adopting these age-friendly policies, using values to remind the public that we have collective responsibility and collective benefits to older adults and our community, right? That's a perfect role for a faith community. Acknowledging the intersectionality and the impact on aging within other identities. I wanted to talk, I think my last slide is some of the terms that have come up in research. So this one's a sensitive one sometimes because language is of all individual. The words that we use are words that we like using to describe ourselves, right? So what I'm talking about are really broad brushstrokes that research has shown about these different terms. So the terms that you see on the left under kind of the minus there are terms that have historically come up as being fairly negative. And the terms on the right are ones that come up to be generally positive. So there's been countless research studies on words used to describe older adults. And one of the classic examples is they ask people to describe a blank person. And they will use the word elderly or older or senior or mature. And by and large, the term elderly evokes images that are highly negative of aging. Frail, wheelchair bound, nursing home, those types of lots of wrinkles, right? Gray hair. The term that's been used in the past is the silver tsunami. Has anyone heard of that? That this demographic shift is this big tsunami of silver-haired people that are going to take over communities, right? On the flip side, the term older adult, people talk about someone of a certain age, a stage of life that's similar to childhood, younger adulthood, and older adulthood. So a little less evocative of some of those negative attributes. Talking about things like the age wave, trying to avoid this idea that, oh my gosh, we have this number of older adults, they're gonna destroy society, there's so many of them, what can we do? We need to run away. Using terms like elder, that's a term that's used very often, particularly in cultural communities. That elder is not just an age that you've attained, but it's a certain state within the community, right? The difference between a caretaker and a caregiver, right? So the idea of a caretaker is generally someone that takes care of something like a building, a cemetery. You might have a caretaker here for your congregation. An apartment building, they often have caretakers. We generally use the word caregiver when we're talking about providing care to a person. Another term the Alzheimer's Association uses is care partner. You're a partner in someone's care. In Europe, the term that they use most often is called carer, C-A-R-E-R. It's not a word that's really taken right here. And then again, I had talked about this concept of trying to avoid that we have an aging population because again, we're all aging, right? And then instead we have this cohort of people who are older than themselves, right? They're over a certain age. They represent part of that group. So some of the things just to think individually about how we can change the way we talk about older people actually does really change the way we think about them. If someone comes up to me and says, I'm working with an elderly person, instantly in mind, I'm like, oh, well, that's someone who lives in a nursing home. Someone who has chronic conditions, right? And so I need to check my own biases in what I think about that person. So I hope that I've given you some new information, some thoughtful information that you can take home. Some of the stuff you can do here in your congregation, thinking through how you plan for your community and for services. My email is here if anyone has any questions or comments. I believe I'm coming back this fall to talk about sort of what is the whole system of services and supports that are out there to help older people remain independent in the community, to support their family caregivers, and how can you connect with them if you're working with people that do need those services and supports. So that's what I have for you today. Before I go, anyone have any questions or thoughts? Yes.
The thought kept going through my mind as you were talking, is ageism ever appropriate? And my thoughts were in the political arena now, ageism is coming up with President Biden and with the senator from California. And the idea that we shouldn't say there is an age limit on being representative or someone in our political government. And yet, there are countless examples of people that were serving long past their ability, and if there had been an ageism limit, they would have been out and a younger person would have come in. So what is your thought on doing something, or is ageism ever appropriate, I guess?
Yeah, good. It's a great question. So for me, that is at the intersections between ageism and ableism. And so we can't make an assumption about an older person just because of their age. We can make a lot of assumptions about children because of their age. That's going to be an ageist statement, but I'm going to back it up here a minute. If I tell you to think of your average 3-year-old, a pretty similar picture is going to come in all of our minds, right? Unless there may be some type of disability, that may change the picture a little bit. But a 3-year-old, all 3-year-olds are generally around the same part of the spectrum. Now, if I say, think of a 70-year-old in your mind. And now if we go around the room and discuss that 70-year-old, it is a very different definition. So we're talking about someone like Senator Feinstein, who is the one who's coming up in the news, and they're questioning her cognitive ability. It is questioning her disability rather than necessarily questioning her age. Now, there is a high correlation between cognitive impairment and age, so you can't ignore that fact. But for me, it's about what, like President Biden, who hasn't experienced or shown any signs of cognitive impairment or anything like that. People are still questioning his capacity to lead because of his age, and is that something we should be doing? Now, on the flip side, we're getting into a little soapboxy here, but we actually live in what's known as a gerontocracy. So even though we have rampant ageism occurring much of our community through popular media, most of the people that are elected to represent us actually are older adults. When you look at the age of members of Congress and our elected officials, they tend to be older people. So, so I appreciate the question. I don't really have a hard and fast answer, but when people do ask me about it, I really do expand it to say that it's not just about aging, but it's also about disability. And I think from the news and reports, people would probably universally, maybe not universally say, I shouldn't say that, that perhaps Senator Feinstein is experiencing some type of disability or something that is causing some challenges for her job. Is that a reason for the people of California to not elect her? That's up to the people of California. So trying to dodge that. Yeah.
I was going to say sometimes it depends on the baseline. So my mother is now approaching her late 80s. And it's my brother and I. My dad died about 30 years ago. We have a conversation occasionally. Or my mom will do something and say, is this something new? No, she's always been kind of
Yeah, that's totally.
But, no, she always gets lost. No, this is very difficult kind of stuff.
Totally.
We remember as kids, as young adults, it's like, no, it's just kind of mom.
Totally.
Remembering names, right?
Exactly.
I got the same issue, right? I can remember faces from 20, 30 years ago, but I couldn't remember a name 2 days ago.
No, it's terrible. And you're sitting there and you're like, oh my God, who is this person that's talking to me? You know, I hope they say their name first.
Yeah.
And it's really when you're introducing people to other people and you have to say their name. Hopefully I know one of their names, so I can just say, oh, this is my friend, you know, Sue. And I'm like, Sue, I want you to meet this friend of mine. God, hopefully they say their name. And usually they do, right? So,
One of our senior pastors, I know we've met, but I just can't remember your name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You meet a lot of people. Yeah.
Did you ever interact with Jerry Blado?
Jerry Blado, an amazing individual.
He was a member of his congregation.
I was actually a Jerry Blado scholarship recipient from the Minnesota Gerontological Society many years ago. So there's a scholarship in his name that's managed by a nonprofit called the Minnesota Gerontological Society. And so he certainly, paved the way for a lot of changing the way we think about older adults. So yeah, he definitely a gem to the congregation.
His wife is still very good.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, very, very good, very dedicated advocate. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much. I need to head out, but. I'm not sure what the
October 25th.
and I realized that like halfway through this.